Historians call it the deadliest earthquake in recorded history. 830,000 dead in a single night. But when you look closely at the data, something becomes deeply unsettling. The earthquake wasn't unusually powerful. The death toll was a choice made centuries before anyone felt the first tremor. There is a category of disaster that science struggles to classify, not because the physics are unclear, not because the historical record is incomplete, but because the disaster itself resists the clean narrative we prefer. We want our disasters to be the result of forces beyond our control: the asteroid, the eruption, the wave that came from nowhere. We are far less comfortable with the alternative, with the possibility that the worst outcomes in human history were not imposed from outside, but were instead constructed by them slowly over generations through decisions that seemed entirely reasonable at the time. The Shaanxi earthquake of 1556 is not, in the conventional sense, a mysterious event. The seismology is well understood. The historical record is relatively detailed for its era. Yet the more carefully you examine it, the more it refuses to behave like an ordinary disaster. It behaves instead like a diagnostic, like a test that a civilization ran on itself without knowing it was running it, and failed in a way that was almost entirely predictable if anyone had been asking the right questions. No one was asking the right questions. That is perhaps the most important thing about it. To understand the Shaanxi event, you have to first understand the geography. The Wei River Valley in what is now Shaanxi province sits at the heart of the Loess Plateau, one of the most distinctive and geologically unusual landscapes on Earth. Loess is a sedimentary material deposited over hundreds of thousands of years by wind-blown dust from the Gobi Desert. To the north and west, it accumulates in deep, uniform layers that can reach hundreds of meters in thickness. It is extraordinarily fertile. Rivers cut through it easily, creating a landscape of dramatic cliffs and deep ravines. And it has one property, above all others, that defines everything that happened in January of 1556. Loess is soft. It is soft enough to be carved with hand tools. Soft enough that a person with modest equipment can excavate a room-sized cavity in a matter of days. Soft enough that entire dwellings, stable, warm, insulated against the brutal winters of the Chinese interior, can be cut directly into the cliff faces, and valley walls without any structural material at all. No timber, no stone, no brick, just the earth itself, hollowed out and inhabited. These dwellings are called Yaodongs, cave dwellings. And in the 16th century, they were not a marginal or impoverished form of housing. They were the dominant architecture of one of the most densely populated agricultural regions in the world. Millions of people lived in them. They had lived in them for generations. Their parents had lived in them. Their grandparents had carved the rooms their parents were born in. The Yaodong was not a temporary shelter or a sign of poverty. It was a rational, elegant, deeply culturally embedded solution to the problem of housing in a landscape that offered soft rock in abundance and timber in scarcity. It was also, under one specific set of conditions, a death trap. Imagine a night in 1556 in China's Shaanxi province. It's January 23rd, just after midnight. Most people are fast asleep in their homes, carved directly into the soft Loess cliffs. These cave dwellings, called Yaodongs, have been the heart of this region for centuries, warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and a testament to human ingenuity. But on this particular night, That ingenuity would meet a force of nature so powerful it would rewrite history. Without warning, the ground began to shake violently. The earthquake, later estimated to be around magnitude 8, struck the heart of the Loess Plateau. This plateau is a massive expanse of wind-blown silt, perfect for carving homes but tragically unstable when shaken. In an instant, entire hillsides collapsed. The very earth that provided shelter turned into a tomb. Hundreds of thousands of Yaodongs, housing countless families, simply imploded, burying everyone inside under tons of compacted soil. The official death toll recorded in imperial annals is a staggering 830,000 people. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire population of San Francisco today. It remains the deadliest earthquake ever recorded in human history. The devastation was almost biblical. In some counties, 60% of the population vanished overnight. Fissures, some over 60 feet deep, ripped open the earth. The landscape was forever changed, with entire mountains flattened and rivers rerouted. For centuries, the story of the Shaanxi earthquake was one of pure, overwhelming natural disaster, a tragic act of God. But modern historians and seismologists have started to ask a different question. Was it just the earthquake that caused this unimaginable loss of life, or was it something more? The answer, it seems, lies in the Yaodongs themselves. While these cave dwellings were practical, they had a fatal flaw. They lacked any structural support that could withstand the lateral shaking of a massive earthquake. When the quake hit, the soft Loess soil essentially liquefied and the caves collapsed inward. People weren't killed by falling buildings of wood and stone. They were suffocated, buried alive in their own homes. This wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a catastrophic failure of architecture meeting an extreme natural event. This tragedy highlights a crucial lesson we still grapple with today. Disaster risk is a combination of hazard and vulnerability. The earthquake was the hazard, but the vulnerability was man-made. The very design of the Yaodongs, which made life so manageable in this region, became a death trap. Had the people lived in timber-framed houses, many more might have survived. It's a sobering reminder that how we build, where we build, and how we prepare can be the difference between a scary event and an unprecedented catastrophe. The 1556 Shaanxi earthquake is more than just a shocking statistic. It's a profound story about the complex relationship between humans, our environment, and the structures we create to survive in it. It forces us to reconsider the simple narratives of disaster and recognize the human element in even the most powerful acts of nature. Thank you for watching. If you found this story thought-provoking, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most impactful moments. What does it mean that a civilization can encode its own catastrophic vulnerability into the most basic layer of its physical existence, and have no mechanism to detect that vulnerability until it expresses itself? This is not a question about 17th century China specifically. It is a question about the relationship between optimization and fragility. About what happens when a solution is so effective in normal conditions that it eliminates the pressure to ask what happens in abnormal ones. About how civilizations, all civilizations, build systems that work brilliantly within a defined envelope of conditions and fail catastrophically outside it. The Yaodong worked. For centuries, it worked. The problem was not that it was a bad solution. The problem was that its failure mode was invisible, and the conditions required to reveal that failure mode occurred less frequently than the kind institutional memory of the civilization that depended on it. This is a pattern, and it is not limited to cave dwellings in 16th century China. Consider the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BC, one of the most sophisticated civilizational networks in human history disintegrated within the span of roughly 50 years. The Late Bronze Age Mediterranean, encompassing the Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittite Empire, the Egyptian New Kingdom, the Ugaritic city-states, and a web of smaller polities connected by maritime trade, had developed what was for its time a remarkably advanced system of economic interdependence. Specialized production, long-distance trade, diplomatic correspondence, surplus agriculture feeding urban populations, the hallmarks of what we would recognize as a complex society. And then, almost simultaneously, it ended. Cities were burned. Populations were displaced. Writing systems were abandoned and not recovered for centuries. The palace economies that had organized production and distribution across the eastern Mediterranean simply ceased to function. The reasons are still debated: drought, invasion by the so-called sea peoples, internal rebellion, earthquake sequences, or some combination of all of these. It was caused by the failure of a system that had become too specialized, too interdependent. The Bronze Age Mediterranean had solved the problem of feeding and organizing large populations through specialization and trade. When the trade routes broke, for whatever reason, perhaps multiple reasons at once, there was no fallback. A solution that works until the conditions that make it work change. The deeper question, the one that the Shaanxi earthquake poses most sharply, is not about the past. And if that vulnerability can remain latent and invisible for generations before expressing itself in a single catastrophic event, then the critical question for any civilization, including this one, is not what disasters have occurred. It is what vulnerabilities are currently latent. What decisions made in the past are encoding failure modes that have not yet had the conditions to express themselves. This is an uncomfortable question because it does not have a clean answer. The nature of latent vulnerability is that it is, by definition, not currently visible. The Yaodong's weakness was not apparent to the people who lived in it. The Bronze Age trade network's fragility was not apparent to the administrators who managed it. The vulnerability only became visible in the moment it became irrelevant, when the conditions changed and the system failed, and the question of what should have been done differently became purely academic. We are not in a position to see our own latent vulnerabilities with perfect clarity. No civilization ever is. But we can look at the structure of our systems and ask whether they share the characteristics that have historically preceded catastrophic failure, whether they are optimized for a narrow range of conditions, whether they have traded redundancy for efficiency, whether their failure modes are visible in normal operation or concealed until an abnormal stress reveals them. The modern global food system feeds approximately 8 billion people. It does so through a supply chain of extraordinary complexity, seeds produced by a handful of global companies grown in a relatively small number of high-productivity agricultural regions, transported through logistics networks that require functioning fuel supplies and navigable infrastructure processed in centralized facilities and distributed to populations that have over the past century steadily lost the capacity to produce food locally. The system works. It works so well that famine, which was the baseline condition of agricultural civilization for most of human history, has been dramatically reduced even as population has grown. The Green Revolution, the development of synthetic fertilizers, the optimization of agricultural genetics, these are genuine achievements of remarkable significance. They are also the mechanism by which a large fraction of the global population has become dependent on a system with a very specific vulnerability profile. The primary inputs to modern industrial agriculture, synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, pesticides, mechanized equipment, are almost entirely derived from fossil fuels. The logistics that move food from production regions to consumption centers require fossil fuels. The refrigeration that keeps food viable through that logistics chain requires electricity. And the agricultural genetics that underpin the productivity of the modern food system are concentrated in a relatively small number of high-yield crop varieties, most of them with significantly less genetic diversity than the traditional varieties they replaced. A disruption to any one of these inputs, sustained for long enough, propagates through the system. A disruption to multiple inputs simultaneously, the kind of disruption that a major geomagnetic storm, or a sustained volcanic winter, or a geopolitical conflict affecting key choke points in the supply chain could produce, does not propagate linearly. It compounds, and the population that depends on the system is not distributed in a way that allows easy transition to alternative food production. It is concentrated in cities on land that has been repurposed for non-agricultural use, in communities that have not maintained the knowledge infrastructure required to produce food at the local level. This is not the Yaodong, but it shares the Yaodong's essential characteristic. It is a solution, a genuinely effective, genuinely impressive solution that has optimized away the redundancy that would make it survivable in abnormal conditions. The same analysis applies, with variations, to the global energy system, the global water system, the global pharmaceutical supply chain, and the global financial system. Each of them represents the application of sophisticated optimization to a genuinely important problem. Each of them has produced real benefits at scale, and each of them, examined through the lens of the Shaanxi variable, reveals a familiar structure, a system whose failure modes are invisible in normal operation, whose vulnerabilities are encoded in the same decisions that produce its efficiency, and whose catastrophic potential is waiting for the specific combination of conditions that will make it visible. Those conditions have not all occurred simultaneously. Not yet. History suggests that they will. Not because catastrophe is inevitable in some mystical sense, but because the statistical distribution of extreme events, seismic, atmospheric, solar, biological, geopolitical, guarantees that sufficiently complex systems will eventually encounter stresses outside their design envelope. The question is always whether the system degrades gracefully or collapses catastrophically when that boundary is crossed. The Yaodong did not degrade gracefully. There is one more dimension to the Shaanxi variable that deserves attention. One more layer beneath the engineering and the systems analysis. In the decades and centuries before the 1556 earthquake, there were people in the Wei River Valley who understood, at some level, that Loess was not ideal construction material for a seismically active region. There is evidence in the historical record of engineers and administrators who advocated for different approaches to housing, construction for buildings that used timber framing, that were set into hillsides rather than carved from them, that incorporated some structural resilience against ground movement. Those arguments did not prevail. They did not prevail because the Yaodong worked, because it was cheaper, because it was traditional, because the people who had always lived in Yaodongs and had never experienced a major earthquake had no experiential basis for understanding the risk that the engineers were describing. Because changing the way millions of people house themselves would have required political will, economic resources, and a kind of sustained institutional attention that is very difficult to maintain for a risk that has not recently manifested. The warning existed. The knowledge existed. The response did not occur. This is the deepest resonance of the Shaanxi variable, not the earthquake, not the Loess, not the physics of liquefaction under seismic load. It is the gap between knowing a vulnerability exists and doing something about it. The gap that appears again and again in the record of civilizational failure. The gap that is not a product of ignorance, but of the structural difficulty of responding to latent risk in the absence of immediate visible harm. In 2023, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its 6th assessment report. It ran to thousands of pages. It synthesized the work of thousands of scientists. It described, in careful and specific detail, the vulnerabilities encoded into current human systems by the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere, the failure modes that will express themselves as global temperatures rise, as precipitation patterns shift, as sea levels change, as extreme weather events increase in frequency and intensity. The report was read. It was discussed. Some policy changes occurred. Not enough. Not fast enough. This is not an argument about climate politics. It is an observation about pattern recognition. The same structure appears. Knowledge of a latent vulnerability encoded into current systems by decisions made over decades. Warning from people who understand the failure mode. Response that is insufficient relative to the scale of the problem. And a slow accumulation of conditions that will, at some point, produce the specific combination of stresses that make the vulnerability visible. The Yaodong stood for centuries before the earthquake came. The question is never whether the earthquake is coming. The question is whether the people inside understand what they built their home from. When the Fermi paradox asks where all the intelligent civilizations are, one possible answer is this: they are where we are. Intelligent enough to build systems of extraordinary sophistication and productivity. Intelligent enough to understand, in principle, the vulnerabilities those systems contain. And consistently, structurally, almost mechanically unable to bridge the gap between that understanding and the action, required to address it before the conditions arrive that make the understanding irrelevant. The great filter in this reading is not an event. It is a capacity. The capacity to look at what you have built, identify what is encoded in its foundations, and make the changes necessary before the earthquake comes, before the solar storm arrives, before the monoculture fails, before the trade network fractures, before the cliff face, which has stood for 3 centuries, decides that tonight is the night it comes down. Every civilization that has ever failed has failed at this, not because the knowledge was absent, because the gap between knowledge and response proved, in the end, to be wider than the window of time available to cross it. We know what we have built. We know, in considerable detail, what is encoded in its foundations. In the supply chains, in the energy infrastructure, in the monocultures, in the financial networks, in the satellites, in the grids, we have the reports, we have the models. We have the engineers and the scientists and the policy analysts who have spent careers mapping the failure modes of the systems that keep 8 billion people alive. The knowledge exists. What we do not know, what no civilization has ever known until the moment the answer became irrelevant, is whether the window between understanding the vulnerability and crossing it is longer than the time it takes the conditions to change. In Shaanxi, the window closed before anyone thought to ask the question. Somewhere in our own foundations, right now, there are decisions that made perfect sense at the time. We just don't know yet which ones they are.